I'm Todd Becker. I write gettingstronger.org. It's a blog about hormesis and health. And I think you'll see that theme come up in the talk today. So I'd like to start with a personal story. I've visited Boulder several times. My son is a student at CU, and every time I come and I return back to California, I find that I've lost about 5 or 10 pounds. Even though, you know, I'm sort of normally physically active, we eat normally maybe even a little bit more than usual, and it's not all paleo food. But this was kind of curious to me, and so I did a little research onto this, and I found that in fact Boulder is distinguished by being exceptionally fit and having a very low rate of obesity and diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and there's some impact on longevity. And you'll see through this talk, I'm kind of going back and forth between obesity, diabetes, longevity. There's a number of different studies, so this is not all about one thing, but I think obesity is a major factor in lifespan. But is there really a fountain of youth process that protects people who live in Boulder and other alpine areas? And can those of us who aren't fortunate enough to live in the mountains benefit by understanding some of the processes that actually protect people who live at high altitude? All right, let's look at some statistics. Boulder actually had the lowest obesity rate in the country in a survey back in 2014, compared to, say, some counties in West Virginia, which are at the other end of the obesity spectrum. And obviously there's a lot of differences. Boulder is in the mountains, has a lot of sunlight, it's a great place to exercise. In this county in West Virginia, it's flat and more urban. You've got a great diet out here. Maybe it's the food, the farm-to-table food, versus the standard American diet. People in Boulder have a higher education rate, and the socioeconomic level, the income is higher. So all of those could be factors. And in fact, you know, I think it's important to say at the start that there's no single cause that explains obesity. It's difficult to separate cause and effect. There's a number of dietary factors. There's debates going on. It could be any of these: calories, carbs, fructose, anti-nutrients, inflammatory factors, fiber, flavor reward. These can all play a role. Certainly exercise, different types of exercise can have a protective effect. And we all know that genetics, ethnicity, and certain genes play a role. And then, of course, there are socioeconomic factors like chronic stress, income level, education level, access to transportation. So even though my theme is about looking at a particular factor that takes place in alpine regions, I don't want to say that I've got a single factor explanation for obesity. So in trying to tease out this protective factor, I think there's something nice about looking at geographic distributions, because they're natural experiments. People generally don't move around where they live every day. You stay there for a few years, whereas a lot of interventional studies around diet or exercise protocols might last a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, and then is it really a sustained effect? So I'm really interested in this geographic aspect of the obesity analysis, because it is a ongoing, sustained factor, and maybe we can learn some things about this protective factor. So let's look at geography, and let's go back 20 years or a little bit more and look at obesity rates and diabetes rates in the different states of the United States. And you can see that back then, in the 90s, obesity rates were typically around, at the high end, maybe in the low 20s, okay? And fairly even distribution, but even back then, there were some differences between the states. If you go 10 years beyond that, in 2004, you can see obesity was creeping up quite a bit. There's some obesity rates in the mid-20s, and you can see some significant differences in the different regions of the country. In fact, look at the Southeast. There's kind of the obesity belt there, and you start to see that Colorado is standing out as being a little bit lighter colored and having obesity rates, you know, well below 20%. And similar trends for diabetes, of course, all right? And now let's look just a few years ago. It's getting worse. Obesity rates now creeping up and even surpassing 30% in many of the states. But look at Colorado. It's just standing out there. And some of the other neighboring states looking pretty good with still low obesity rates. So what's going on there? Why are those other states, Colorado and others, bucking the trend? I think it's useful to drill down one more level and look at a county-by-county map, all right? And now you see a little bit more. You see that this obesity belt in the southeast is getting redder and redder, and almost the entire west, certainly with Colorado, it's its center, is staying pretty lean. And the same thing is true if you look at diabetes. Very, very similar pattern. So what could explain this? One theory is it's urbanization, access to transit and healthy food, living near farmers markets versus having to shop at substandard food outlets. And that could be a factor, maybe. Maybe it's physical activity, right? So here's some results of a survey estimating physical activity, but I think these kind of surveys are a little bit hard to interpret. Do people reliably report how many hours they exercise? You still see the trends there, but it doesn't really map quite as well as that obesity map. Now, what I thought was the most striking is let's compare obesity to altitude. And now it just jumps out at you. If you look at the map on the right, altitude, you can see that it's not just the Rockies and Colorado. The entire West is actually, even though there's some flat areas, is at a much higher elevation. And in fact, it seems to be a protective effect. Now, what I find was really striking, and this is what really got me thinking about this, is look at that sort of sea of obesity in the southeast. And you'll see I've circled the Appalachian Mountains. So even though it's surrounded by the sea of obesity, there's a lot of lean people living along that ridge in the Appalachian Mountains. And so how do you explain that? And now let's look at Europe. This is a little bit different. It's longevity versus altitude, but again, longevity, obesity, they're very tightly paired. And here, if you look very carefully, you'll see there is a band of high altitude and going through Switzerland, northern Italy, up in Norway, northern Spain, and then look at, I'm sorry, that's longevity. Look at also the altitude, the same kind of trends here that you see. So a very close correlation. Well, you can look at maps until you're blind, but is there real statistics behind this? And there was a study done by Voss et al., which looked at 422,000 individuals across the US, and it controlled for the effects of age, sex, race, ethnicity, education, employment, and it found a statistical effect there. And what you could see here is that on the y-axis, you see the proportion of obese going 10, 20, 30%, and on the x-axis, you see altitude rounded to the nearest kilometer, 1, 2, 3 kilometers. And right at about 2 kilometers, it just drops off. The obesity rates just drop. Now, I put Boulder on here, which has got 12% obesity, about a mile high, to show that it's actually doing better than this trend. And what that serves to show is that there's big error bars around here, but this is a statistically valid trend. And just to kind of check that, because there's a lot of factors involved in explaining obesity in the US, I looked at a study of Tibetans. And I think that's a nice study because it's a single culture, similar genetics, similar economic strata, and people living at 3,900, 9,500, 12,000 feet. You can see in the chart up at the right-hand corner that the obesity rate drops in half. And there were some statistics done on this looking at BMI, showing that for every kilometer there was a 1.3 kilogram per meter squared change in BMI. And interestingly, at the higher altitudes, the caloric intake went up and the physical activity went up. So that's kind of curious. People were eating more and were more active at the higher altitudes. And this is, statistically valid. So what might link altitude to obesity? Well, there's a couple possibilities. Maybe it's exercise, because you're walking up and down slopes all the time. Well, that's not quite true, because there's areas that are pretty flat and are high altitude, like Utah, and you don't have the mountains there. Ethnicity, maybe it's a rural-urban effect. Well, the Tibetan study, I think, kind of shows that you can be in the same ethnic group, same income range, and there's still an effect. Maybe it's more UV radiation and a hormetic stimulus from vitamin D synthesis. Well, if you look at it, there's inconsistent results in terms of whether there's a lot of sun or clouds in these alpine regions. Maybe it's air quality. Again, it's inconsistent. The one thing that I found that seemed to show up again and again in studies was hypoxia, which is low oxygen levels. The percentage of oxygen decreases as we go up in altitude, all right? So, in fact, there's numerous studies, and I'll go over a few of them, showing that, in fact, hypoxia experimentally and also observationally decreases obesity, body weight, diabetes, arterial blood pressure, dementia, and it increases, your cardio fitness, VO2 max, mitochondrial biogenesis, insulin sensitivity, the number of glucose transporters, a lot of effect on vasculature, blood vessel growth, peripheral vasodilation, blood platelets, hemoglobin, etc. Okay? So, in fact, there's been some interesting interventional studies where they took, this is in Germany, going to the highest peak, the Zugspitze in Germany, where they took obese male subjects who had a high BMI up for a week. And they monitored them before, while they were up, riding the tram up to the top, and then for 4 weeks after they came down. And they found food intake spontaneously decreased, their metabolic rate increased, their weight and blood pressure decreased, and their leptin plasma levels went up and their leptin sensitivity went up. And all of these effects were sustained for many weeks after they came back to sea level. I thought that was pretty interesting. There's also a study, and this was done nearby at the CU Denver School of Medicine and in collaboration with Harvard, and it was a study looking at death certificates across all the counties in the US. And they bucketed people into those living at sea level versus those living at 4,900 feet and above, right? And what they found was very interesting. Among men, there was an extra 1.5 to 3.5 years of lifespan, and women, almost as much, up to 2.5 years. There was reduced heart disease. Interestingly, there was increased COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and I can get into why that might be later. All right, but this was, again, an interesting study. Athletes have recognized this, and people train at high altitude. There was a really interesting study, and this was by Levine et al., looking at two protocols. One is where you spend most of your time living at high and training at, or living at high altitudes, which is, in this case, 8,100 feet, and then training at low altitudes, or the reverse, living at low altitudes and training at high altitudes. And the results were unambiguous. It was the first protocol that worked better. Spending a lot of time at high alpine regions and training low, where speed, power, oxygen flux, all the blood counts were improved, and the reverse was true with the opposite protocol. And then there was a meta-analysis of 11 other studies, again finding that to really get this benefit, you had to be at least 9.5 hours per day for at least 2 weeks experiencing the hypoxia of high altitude. Oh, one other thing on there, there was kind of a fad about wearing these hypoxic masks, people trying to decrease the amount of oxygen right during a short training interval, and I think some of the studies showed that that really is not effective. Okay, so this is interesting. It's just looking at statistics. It's observational. Are there some mechanisms here that we can tap into? And in fact, a few have been proposed. One is hormone signaling, the effect on leptin and insulin sensitivity. Another one is what I'd call hormetic sensing, and this is the PGC1 alpha, FNDC5 BDNF pathway, which I'll get into. And the other is an anti-aging pathway, which is the stimulation, or sorry, the repression of mTOR. Okay, so what are the experimental results? Well, hypoxia does increase leptin signaling, and there's a study looking at intermittent hypoxia in rats with an alternating protocol, and they saw an increase in circulating leptin levels, but also a sensitization of the leptin receptors. Hypoxia increases neurogenesis. Again, BDNF levels measured with an antibody go up significantly. There's an antidepressant-like effect in these behavioral tests in rats, and again, a big effect on BDNF, and also on cell proliferation in the hippocampus. And also, hypoxia, this should say, sorry, decreases mTOR. The mTOR is the master regulator of protein synthesis and growth processes. It's associated with aging and degenerative diseases. And this was a study, again, looking at hypoxia, which found that the red protein was upregulated and that repressed mTOR. So again, this is the biological function of mTOR, is to conserve energy by limiting protein synthesis. So let's put this into, I think, a single picture that summarizes all of these effects. And I'm going to start with hypoxia, but I'll come back and show that this is actually a more generalized function. So there is this sensing system, which is the peroxisome proliferator activated gamma coactivator 1 gamma protein, abbreviated PGC1 alpha, and this binds with the PPAR gamma receptor. This is the master regulator of mitochondrial biosynthesis. It's really important, but the important thing is this is the protein that interacts with the outside world, with external stresses like hypoxia. And it starts this cascade. In the brain, it upregulates a protein called irisin and BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It controls leptin sensitivity, and it leads to all these effects like appetite suppression, the urge to exercise, insulin sensitivity, and autophagy. But it's not just in the brain. This cascade also happens in the liver and in the muscle, and interestingly, it turns on thermogenesis. It converts white adipose tissue, you know, that visceral fat that's bad, to brown adipose tissue, the brown fat that stimulates thermogenesis and helps with activity and more efficient energy utilization. So we heard a little bit about BDNF in some of the other talks. It's important in central metabolism. It's stimulated by exercise, by cold, and by hypoxia, and it promotes neurogenesis. Low BDNF levels are correlated with obesity. But also in peripheral metabolism, in the muscle, in the fat, in the brain, it has a lot of benefits too. It increases thermogenesis and it improves insulin sensitivity. This PGC1 alpha cascade also spurs autophagy, all right, which is the recycling of damaged intracellular proteins and other components. It enhances cellular fitness and extends longevity in a lot of animal studies. I think the key thing that connects autophagy to longevity is you're recycling all of these damaged proteins, you're controlling inflammation, you're controlling oncogenesis, and you're slowing down cell aging. It also helps with the innate immune response and removal of intracellular pathogens. Okay, so this is interesting, all these mechanisms out there. There does seem to be some biochemical explanations for why living at high altitude and hypoxia might be beneficial. But do we really need to move to the mountains and wear these hypoxia masks to get the benefit? If you live in Boulder, you're lucky, but what about if you live at sea level? Well, here I'd like to get into, briefly, a few theories of aging. There's the genetic program theory, which is basically, you know, we have a fixed lifespan, our telomeres control everything, and we can hack this to some extent by hormone supplementation. Interesting theory, but it hasn't always worked out that way. Sometimes hormone supplementation causes cancer and other problems. There's the damage accumulation theory, which is, you know, that we got to protect ourselves from free radicals and DNA damage, so we should take antioxidants and avoid toxins and UV and cell phones. But antioxidants can mess up the cellular signaling that's often oxidative, and one really interesting example, which I'll talk about, is the naked mole rat, which is a counterexample to this theory. The theory that I think is the most interesting is the hyperfunction theory of Blagosklani, Walter Longo, and Ron Rosedale is also, I think, fitted into this category. And this is the idea that the diseases of aging are really about overactive cellular processes that run past the stage in life where they're beneficial. So we need to have growth factors and high growth rates when we're young and coming into maturity until the age of reproduction. But after that, these processes continue. If mTOR stays high, you get inflammation, more cell division, lipogenesis, increased fat. So how do you deal with this theory of aging? And I think this is where hormesis comes in, especially after middle age. We can restrict calories, exercise, expose ourselves to cold and hypoxia and bitter herbs, and this counteracts the mTOR pathway. There's a really interesting book here, Spring Chicken, that Bill Gifford wrote that goes into these three theories, and actually one of the chapters is about a little adventure with me, swimming in the ocean and talking about hormesis. But there's another part of that chapter about the naked mole rat, and in which Gifford goes into this really interesting study that if, in fact, the cause of aging is oxidation and oxidative stress, then why does the naked mole rat, which lives underground when it's now in captivity and exposed to really high oxygen levels, which damage all the proteins, why can it live to 30 years when normal mice can only live to 3? Well, it turns out it has a lot of upregulation of endogenous protective mechanisms. So how do we get those protective mechanisms activated in ourselves? And this is where hormesis comes in. What is hormesis? Some people get it confused with homeopathy. It's not. It's actually a very well-defined, well-studied biological phenomenon. It's the beneficial response of an organism to low-dose stressors that would otherwise be detrimental at very high doses. And if you look at the plot there, that's illustrated by, at the very high end, you see a detrimental or inhibitory effect of a stressor, but at low doses, you actually get a protective effect, and that's because it's stimulating these defense, repair, and adaptation mechanisms. You get a supercompensation effect, increased resilience to stressors, and it has to be looked at as an optimum. You don't want to overdo hormesis or you get into harm. I mean, a classic example is exercise. There's an optimum amount. You overdo it and you get damage, you get sore or worse. So hormesis, general term, I like to put it into 4 buckets. There's structural hormesis where you're changing tissues. That's like weightlifting, barefoot running. You're remodeling, the bone, the muscle. Tanning changes, melanin in your skin. And then I've looked at also how the use of defocus can change the eye and reduce myopia. And I gave a talk on that 2 years ago at AHS. There's defense hormesis, which is how do we improve our immune system? Well, you can do this through allergen immunotherapy, through consuming polyphenol compounds like curcumin, green tea, caffeine, which work with the NRF2 system, the phase 2 enzymes, to improve your antioxidant defense. And on the other side, there's what I would call psychological hormesis. There's some conditioning effects that you can benefit from. But what I'd like to talk about here is what I call metabolic hormesis. This is calorie restriction, exercise, cold exposure, and hypoxia. And coming back to that diagram I showed you earlier, let's add in all the other external stressors that upregulate metabolic hormesis, all right? So this PGC1 alpha cascade, it responds to hypoxia, but it responds to cold, it responds to calorie restriction and exercise. And I thought this is really cool. It's a universal stress sensor and it activates the mitochondria to grow and develop. The thing is, are all of these stresses the same? No. They act on different tissues to different degrees, but it's the same metabolic pathways. And in fact, you can see here, it's been worked out that PGC1 alpha senses not just hypoxia, but cold and energy status in general. It's an energy reporter. It tells us how to respond to the glucose and fats in our bloodstream, but also to the external world. All right. What's really interesting is a study by Nunn et al. Showing that this kind of hormesis doesn't just control appetite, it also promotes what they call exercise salience. It's your urge to exercise, all right? And this is done through many different pathways. I think one of the most important one is in the hypothalamus, all right? And conversely, inflammation can inhibit all of these processes. It can slow down mitochondrial function and energy release. Interestingly enough, you can be in an inflammatory environment and hormesis will counteract that to some extent. It will protect you from inflammation. So what's really interesting here is that you've got two cycles. One I would call the virtual circle of hormesis, all right? You have hormesis, you're exercising, you're out in the cold, you're up in the mountains, you're restricting your calories. You get mitochondrial biogenesis. Your energy factory is turned on. Now you've got a lot of energy. You want to be more physically active, and at the same time, it suppresses your appetite. Okay? So then you can engage in more hormesis, and it reinforces itself. All right? On the other hand, what's the opposite? It's the inflammatory lifestyle. If you don't have enough hormesis in your life, your mitochondria are not going to be as strong. You don't have as much energy supply. You're going to have not so much urge to get out and exercise, a lot of urge to eat, and you're going to be a sedentary, motivated by comfort. You're going to eat more food, and you're going to be in that inflammatory zone. This paper by Alistair Nunn, I thought it was a beautiful paper. I really would encourage you to read it, and I'm just going to give 2 quotes here as I kind of wrap up the talk. Maybe what's going on in the modern world is a hormesis shortage. So let me read this. Ancient man was a hunter-gatherer, often traveling long distances to find food, avoid threats, and seek shelter. In contrast, many modern Western societies have transformed their surroundings in order to minimize or even eliminate environmental threats and stresses that our ancestors were exposed to, including food and water shortages, predation, infections, extremes of temperature, and the need to carry out regular physical activity. The result is a vicious cycle that increases oxidative stress, reduces metabolic flexibility, and perpetuates the disease state. In contrast, hormetic stimuli can induce an anti-inflammatory phenotype, thereby enhancing exercise salience, the urge to exercise, leading to greater biological fitness and improved functional longevity. So, here's the take home. Activate your inner boulderite. You don't need to live a mile high to get all the benefits of hormesis. Push yourself to tolerate discomfort and even enjoy it a little bit. Start out gradually and build up your tolerance. Take cold showers. This is one of the most powerful ways to get into hormesis. A 5-minute investment every morning and you're feeling great all day. Give it 2 weeks. Don't be scared of the first cold shower. Hike and lift heavy things. I mean, we've heard this is a great theme through the whole conference. Activate those pathways. Eat less frequently. All of these things activate the same cascade of beneficial responses. Okay? So I have a number of resources here, references on altitude, obesity, and health. I'm going to flash these up, and you can look at the YouTube if you want to read them in more detail. The hypoxic mechanisms, right, and the hormetic mechanisms. There's a lot of good information here. I've tried to just digest it and summarize it. But I hope really you'll take the practical lessons and try to go out for a walk today. And do this. When you get back home, weigh yourself and see maybe you have lost a few pounds by being up in the mountains. All right, any questions?
Hi, this is kind of a question for the whole group, but who here lives at high altitude? Okay.
Great talk. What I saw, I missed the first part, so you may have addressed this. In the late 1800s, Sir Joseph Barcroft, a British physiologist, introduced a concept called Mount Everest in utero, which has since been shown to be true, that the ambient oxygen that a mother takes in during pregnancy, the placenta gives about the amount that is tantamount to an adult on top of Mount Everest, but 2,000 feet even above that. So fetuses are competing for oxygen with the mom, and most of us don't know. Ask me, I just learned this, and it's in my talk at 150. If anybody can come, it will build on this. It explains, it supports what you were talking about, why we do so well at high altitude and why we so easily adapt, because for millions of years of pre-human and human evolution, we have learned to adapt in utero to a hypoxic environment, which explains also why you mess with that environment a little, like smoking, and now what's called gestational apnea. It leads to intrauterine growth restriction and possibly death stillborn. So great talk, more evidence.
Good point, and I did want to make one comment on that. As with all kinds of hormesis, you can overdo it, and you have to be aware of your state. So people can get altitude sickness by pushing it too quickly and not adapting. COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, makes things worse when you get to high altitude. So you got to be in a healthy state. But as with all hormesis, you can gradually push your tolerance. Go ahead, next question.
Hi, I'm visiting from the Seattle area, so sea level. I came several days early because my parents grew up here in the state of Colorado, and I wanted to do some personal stuff, touring cemeteries and things like that. So one of the places I visited was the Air Force Academy. It was a very brief visit, but somewhere, and I can't remember where, it seemed that I heard that or read that the reason that they selected Colorado and the altitude for the Air Force Academy was because of the enhancement of the physical conditioning of the recruits and the cadets. And I didn't know if this was true and if you had anything to say about that.
No, I think that there are some studies showing that, and in fact, Olympic athletes also do training at high altitude for exactly this reason. But as I pointed out, you got to be up there for a few weeks to really get the benefit.
Thanks for a great talk. I wonder if you could engage in a little bit of wild speculation comparing particularly Boulder to Salt Lake City, Utah, and maybe more Park City. And where I'm going with this is probably lower alcohol consumption in Utah, probably lower coffee consumption in Utah, and also among devout Mormons, the practice of fasting once a month. So those are sort of confounding variables.
Those are confounding, yeah. Well, I think I mentioned in the beginning that obesity, diabetes, longevity is multifactorial. And I think if you looked at that map, even though it was green through most of the West, there were some pockets around Salt Lake and probably Las Vegas that didn't look quite as good, because there's the effect of urbanization. And some of those habits you mentioned are probably working against you. The fasting may be working for you. So it's confounding variables. And I think you have to take this with a grain of salt. This is just one variable. It doesn't explain everything.
But just belaboring the alcohol point a little bit, because there's a fair amount of alcohol consumption in Boulder, I'm happy to say.
Yeah. Well, I didn't list it here, but alcohol is a hormetin. It has a hormetic effect. Again, look at that dose response curve. There's an optimum level. You go beyond that optimum, it starts to hurt you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm not sure what this has to do with hormesis, but if you dig out the CDC maps of the United States for suicide, you will find at the higher altitudes, without question, there's just tons more suicide. It peaks in Wyoming, which has the highest rates of all. It's very high in Utah. It's very high in Colorado. It's very high in all the mountain states. Do you have any explanation?
I read that, and I don't have an explanation. I wish I could explain it.
I mean,
I saw some speculation on it, but
it makes me want to live at sea level based on a lot of the studies, seriously, that have to do with that.
But I think that effect got particularly worse at really high altitudes.
And now it's by state. If you look
It's
at it
by
by
state?
state,
Yeah.
It's absolutely kind of
Yeah, I think
frightening.
you've got to almost look at a county level for some of these things.
Same thing there.
Yeah.
It's not like your maps. It's like
Okay.
regular. It seems to have a direct connection with how high you live normally.
Yeah. I wish I had an
And
explanation
that
for it.
it's a mental thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was an awesome question. That was my question.
Okay.
So my question is, have you looked at any of the radiation hormesis or other effects like that, you know how it was a theory that radiation is accumulative, and now we're finding out that it was a theory and that low-level radiation can actually be quite healing, and that they had to do it twice because they couldn't believe the results. On the East Coast, where there's a lot of radon, the cancer and certain illness rates went the higher your radon levels were. So I was wondering if you had looked at that type of hormetic effect with radiation and longevity, and have anybody studied telomere length with some of the hormetic effects you're talking about here? Because I've studied them in another way, but I haven't studied these ones.
Yeah, I didn't get into radiation hormesis. There's a whole literature on that. There's more controversy there. I think there is an effect. It's a little bit hard to get conclusive data there. But
How
yeah.
about the decrease in disease in general with Hormesis? Is there an decrease in disease and also means increased longevity at the same time? And has anybody looked at any of the other hormetic effects besides radiation hormesis and telomere length and longevity?
They have. I didn't, have a chance to summarize that. We could talk after the
Okay,
break. I have
cool.
some information on that, but I tried to keep this focused
Sure,
on
gotcha.
hypoxia. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thanks so much.
Yep.
Hi. So when I hear about oxygen consumption and hypoxia, I immediately think mitochondria. And I think, metabolic efficiency and all that. And then I immediately think cancer, I think Alzheimer's, I think any modern illness connected to mitochondrial dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
So your talk was focused mostly on obesity and longevity, and I'm just wondering if you've seen any data on morbidity in general from chronic disease and altitude, whether it's cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, anything like that.
There were some studies on dementia and Alzheimer's. I couldn't find any good studies that were population-wide on longevity, except for that one study that I mentioned that showed a slight increase in lifespan of men and women living at high altitude. There just wasn't as much information as I could find on obesity and diabetes. So I would be, I think we'd have to go back to the literature.
Okay.
to
And
see.
do you think there's any difference between being born in a high altitude area and living there your whole life versus, let's say, moving to one when you're 40 or 50?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Thank you.
Hi, great talk. I used to run ultramarathons, and in the ultrarunning community, they often recommend for specifically high altitude runs of the 100-mile distance, if you're not able to get out to the race site 2 weeks beforehand, it's better to show up, just 1 or 2 days before. They really recommend not coming out, 4, 5, 6 days ahead of time. They say you don't get any added benefit, and it's preferable to arrive just 1 or 2 days before. Would you have any idea what the mechanism at play would be there, or if that is just a total bunk argument? Any idea for that?
Yeah, I don't know, but like anything else, hormetic effects take time to experience the adaptation. For example, hypoxia initially is a disadvantage, right? You're not able to, your VO2 max goes down. But as you get more mitochondrial biogenesis and more hemoglobin and red blood cells, you get that benefit. So you really got to be training for several weeks to get the benefit. So maybe the advice is good if you can't come out for that period of time, and if you're only out there for 3 or 4 days, you might actually experience a decrement in your performance. But I'd have to see the study you're talking about to really know.
Great, thank you.
I live at altitude, Big Sky, Montana, from 7,500 to 9,500.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mountain community. Everything you put up on your slides, you're right, you experience at altitude. I was going to hit the suicide problem. And there's, at least in Montana, might be different Colorado because it's sunnier, but Montana, it's cloudy much of the year. It's because of the storms coming in. And so that can be depressing. The number 2 is everybody in that community seems to be active. All right, and I don't know if it's hormesis or self-selected, and I also get the feeling that when they lose their ability to be active, they don't want to live any longer. So I think that's a big contributor to suicides.
Yeah, the suicide one I read about, and it mystified me because there were these studies in rats and in humans showing that hypoxia causes your BDNF to go up, right? So that should be the opposite effect. So to me, it's still a paradox that needs some explanation. So I have to wrap up. Keep in mind, this was a bit of a speculative talk. I'm just looking for things there. I think I found a trend that's worth following after, but there's a lot of unanswered questions. So it's just food for further thought and further investigation. But thank you for coming.